Good afternoon and welcome to today's Industry Week webcast, Extending Edge Computing to the Shop Floor. My name is Jill Jusko. I'm Executive Editor with Industry Week, and this event is sponsored by Intel. Before we begin, I'd like to explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First, if at any time you're having audio difficulties or your slides aren't advancing, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. And if you are running pop-up blocking software, you will need to disable that to view the webinar. If you're having any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the $help button in the upper right corner to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the maximize icon in the upper right corner to enlarge the window. And we welcome your participation during today's event. When you have a question, simply type that question into the Ask a Question window on the left side of your screen and then hit the submit button. We will be addressing as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that follows the main presentation. But please feel free, and in fact, we encourage you to send in your questions at any time as they occur to you so that we can add them to the queue. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and it will be available on the Industry Week website within the next day for you to review. You will be notified by email when that archive is available. When the webinar ends, we ask you to please take a moment to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen. Now I'd like to take a moment to welcome today's speakers. We have joining us Ricky Watts. Ricky is Senior Director, Intel Internet of Things Group. And joining Ricky today is Mark Wohlfarth, Global Sales Leader, Industrial Sector and Edge Computing with Red Hat. Gentlemen, welcome. Oh, I also should mention that if you need more information, there is additional bios on the speaker tab. Also, now I'd like to welcome Ricky. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jill. Much appreciated, and thanks for the introduction. Firstly, I just want to say it's fantastic to be here together today with Mark to talk a little bit about the industrial and the edge and what's going on there. And hopefully we're going to get into some really interesting topics as we go along. I just have I mentioned very quick apologies. Unfortunately, this time of year brings colds and coughs. So if you see me coughing a little bit, you'll know that what that's about. Nothing too serious, I would add, but just wanted to let you know that. But anyway, just to sort of frame this conversation, and I'll hand over to Mark. So as Jill mentioned, I work in the Internet of Things group, and I cover the industrial market segments for Intel. And really, I've been looking at this industrial transformation for a number of years now and really trying to understand it from a customer perspective, what's going on. We call it Industry Transformation 4.0. What does that really mean? What does it mean for customers? And, if I look at that industrial domain right now, they're going through massive amounts of changes in terms of the way that industrial is set up, is going forward and how that's going to be done. Different use cases, artificial intelligence. How can I improve things in my factory? I've got cost constraints. What are those cost areas that I've got to go and address? How can I do that with technology? What does it really mean for my business, my people, my processes? So I kind of look at all of those aspects, and really what myself and Mark are going to kind of go through a little bit today is how we look at the partnership, and some of the things that we're doing are really about addressing customer problems. It's not about technology for technology's sake. That is not where we're about between us and Red Hat. It really is looking at those challenges, be they technology challenges, be they business challenges. How can we help them to achieve their goals? How can we help them improve the output of their factory, reduce defect detection, improve the way that they connect with their customers, improve the way that they operate their factory, particularly in and around these things called COVID these days, which change things, demonstrably in terms of the way that we're going. So again, I just wanted to give that a quick frame and great to have an opportunity to speak to you. And Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you. Maybe you've got some words in terms of introduction about what we're doing and how things are going.
Yeah, happy to, and happy to be here. Thanks for including us in this. Ricky, the introduction that you made there really resonates with me. For Red Hat, we're, like Intel, we're very focused across, the whole industry, right? We're very much a horizontal platforms company. And for us, the amount of change that's happening in the industrial sector right now is really thrilling. I mean, it's really an exciting time. And we see this partnership with Intel as a great way to help stimulate that change and advance it further in the right direction. And I'm looking forward to having a bit of discussion about where that is going. But we really see this as a change a point where, all the buzzwords around Industry 4.0 and all of that are really starting to make, meaningful change. And the kind of wave of change that we saw in the IT space over the last 10 or 15 years really is playing out in the OT space. And that's what we're really excited to be participating in, and where we see this partnership really helping to stimulate the right kind of change on that. And maybe, I'd love to maybe start with a discussion about some of the terminology, because, I feel like Intel and Red Hat have a very similar approach to the way we look at this market, looking about across a number of the sectors in the industrial space broadly, similar use cases that we're focusing on. But we do use slightly different terminology, and there's a lot of terms out in the market. Your team is called the IoT Group. Red Hat, we have a company-wide Edge initiative. We talk about Industry 4.0, OT transformation. In all of those kind of IT-OT convergence, in all of those terminology, language, what do you feel like is really important about the change that's happening today? And, how do you see that conversation kind of evolving going forward?
Good question, Mark. And again, the world we live in is full of acronyms, and I always start with the first one, which is, what is the edge? I mean, you could get 1,000 different definitions of that. We'll probably be here talking about that tomorrow. And you mentioned I'm in the Internet of Things group, and the Internet of Things group really is around all of the segments that cover the edge. My particular focus and our particular focus of our team is around those industrial areas. So the industrial covers this: manufacturing, process and discrete manufacturing, manufacturers who make things, machine builders, process manufacturers who are really using physics and mixing things together. You've seen this in chemical manufacturers and things like that. And we also cover the energy markets. But I want to stand back and just say, when you talk about us in the IoT group, when we talk about the edge and where we're looking at, I mean, ultimately there is, if you look across all of those domains, it's a very similar problem. So whether you're in healthcare, retail, or in the industrial markets that I cover, what are they trying to do? What are the areas that they're looking at? And really, if I stand back and say, hey, most of that world has been living in what we would call this fixed function type of appliance, we call it. So you build a machine to do a job in a factory, whether it's to run a conveyor belt, turn a motion controller, whatever it is, it's full of machines. And really, as we're starting to look at this edge, it really is around, you mentioned the word IT, an IT-like operating environments. What we want to do is bring those IT-like operating environments into this operational domain. So, to bring that kind of, that very much flexible way of looking at infrastructure. And that applies across all of those domains of the edge. So, how can I build a platform? And again, that's why I love this partnership with you guys today, which is, it's really about building a platform that meets with those industrial requirements. And there are always going to be specific things, standards and things like that are needed. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is create an infrastructure that sits around the edge, sits in those use cases, that allows companies to go and build applications and services, manage them with IT-like infrastructure, but really be much more efficient. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, so I'm going to pose a question back to you now, Mark, which is, okay. So, this word open source, I mean, it's a loaded term, as we know. I mean, so an open source in manufacturing is relatively new for manufacturers. They don't come out of the cloud world so much. So what does open source mean? Why is there a heightened interest? And how do you think maybe open source might be applied in this kind of evolved edge, this manufacturing world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, and that's what's really pulling us into this space and why we're so excited about it is because there has been a real, over the last few years, there's been a just explosion of activity around open source in the space. And, it follows the traditional pattern where maybe people took some stuff that they were doing in-house and brought it in to try to create a community around it. But we're also seeing communities forming around specific issues like, data exchange and having a more open approach to data. And also just the broader manufacturing transformation. So you have, things that are forming around specific technologies, things that are focusing around specific problems, and just a broader, kind of emphasis on manufacturing change. People are turning to open source. And, there's still a lot of learning going on, as, we would observe, open source from a governance standpoint, open source is hard, and there's some learning pains for organizations that invest in it. Not everybody has been like Intel and Red Hat, in the open source communities for years and years. But it is really taking off, and we're excited about that. And we want to encourage that development. We're starting to invest more in very manufacturing and energy specific communities in order to help stimulate that change. And in a lot of ways, I have worked a lot with the telecoms market, and the change that the telecoms industry went through with network transformation initiatives and the way that they learned to leverage and integrate open source into their work. It's a very similar pattern happening now in industrial. And frankly, I see it happening faster. And in a lot of ways, people I feel like are learning from some of the experiences that the telecom industry went through, over the last 10 years with NAV and SDN and everything. So I think it's an exciting time. We're really excited about the investment in that. And we're starting to see, and I think our partnership announcement is an example of that. We're starting to see things that were maybe formerly open source, but leveraging just upstream components to coming to more, using productized open source offerings like what Red Hat provides. And I'd love to just ask you about that, Ricky. The edge controls for industrial, the edge insights for industrial. These are Intel reference architectures that Intel's been developing and working on with customers and partners for some time. And, now bringing Red Hat into that work, and we can, drive this forward together is the goal of the partnership. But I'm curious about the thinking that, what does that bring as you take in these reference architectures, you bring, Red Hat technologies into what you've been doing already with upstream components?
No, and thanks, Mark. A good question. And I'm going to peel it back a little bit and peel the onion a little bit. We talk about open source and we talk about some of the architectures, which I'll get into in a moment. If you looked at it from a customer perspective on an outside in, one of the problems that a lot of legacy manufacturers have is in the operational environment, it's a machine. I mentioned that fixed function machine that does something in the factory. It's a controlled environment. That's very inflexible, for a manufacturer. If he wants to reconfigure that machine to be able to go and get it to do something else, that's a challenge because he's got to go back to the maker of that machine and go and work with him to get that done. You talk about open source. It's really about being open. So I want to be able to take devices and at the end that sit at the edge of the network, be they motion controllers, sensors, or whatever. And I want to be able to connect them into applications that sit on an infrastructure. And that's where open source and open comes in. So that I break down this kind of silo mentality in manufacturing that has been brilliant. I mean, manufacturers, they make things or they produce things. So they want to be absolutely assured of the certainty of getting those things out of their manufacturing. But of course, now we're moving into a much more different world. They're very competitive. So what they want to be able to do is to break that silo down and be much more flexible. So open source and open source as a business model allows them to build something around that framework to connect different devices, even different applications and services. It allows them to share the data that was previously locked in those machines and bring that out. So now I'm going to go back to the second part about your question. You talked about this thing called edge controls and edge insights for industrial. In Intel, we're a silicon company. It's what we do, We make the best silicon on the planet. And one of the things that we're trying to do is, as we start to think about how do we go through this industry transformation, what we want to do in this operational domain is to show, hey, what's possible on top of these Intel platforms? So we built these reference architectures, these software architectures. Edge Insights for Industrial was about how do I take Intel technologies, connect them into the factory environment, and abstract and bring off the data. So improving video ingestion pipeline, time series data, allowing us to aggregate that data in an industrial fashion. There's industrial protocols and languages. So think of it as an architecture that allows us to take that out. Edge controls. So I got information that's coming out, and now I want to be able to do something in this control environment. Data, you use data to drive something, to learn something. When you learn something, you want to be able to act that back into your manufacturing environment. So you want to be able to connect it back into the factory operations. Well, again, how do we break down, how do we open up this fixed function type of device in controls and bring that out? So Edge Controls is a reference architecture, and it enables things such as time-sensitive networking, low latency applications, high performance, high availability. So these are reference architectures that enables us to show what can be done. And then for me, the fantastic thing about the Red Hat relationship is Red Hat has this wonderful infrastructure. It knows how to build solutions for customers, service them, support them. Now I can bring these technologies, these architectures into the Red Hat stack. And that enables you to extend the reach of what you've done before into these industrial domains. So it's a 1 + 1 = way more than 2 scenario for customers. So again, that's kind of where we see, these things coming. So I suppose as I kind of look at that then, Mark, so now we've kind of got that framework. Where do you see, some of the opportunities here that you think that this is going to open up? Where do we go with this, from a partnership perspective?
Yeah, well, that was really well said, first of all. And so I completely agree with your view of the power of this. And I think one aspect of what we need to be doing and where the opportunity is around the change that's happening within the industrial control systems vendors themselves. That whole OT ecosystem, OT platforms world, however you want to define it, is also going through the change. Just like end customers are thinking about how do we leverage these technologies and open source technologies increasingly to solve specific use cases. We have the ecosystem going through change. And so one of the things that I think will really help us scale the work that Intel has started around ECI and EII is bringing in, the industrial control systems vendors into this reference architecture work, turning that into solutions tailored to specific use cases. And that's, really, I think the focus that Red Hat brings to this is leveraging the power of the ecosystem as we build this out. Red Hat has been really focusing, as we've been thinking about our edge work overall, we're really focused on this concept of validated patterns, taking, patterns that we're seeing, testing them, proving them, bringing, more robust, scalable solutions to them, and then supporting that, being rolled out through the ecosystem. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to, play that model and drive scale. The other aspect of, I think, where this is going, which is really important, is as you look at the types of edge solutions that have been deployed, the first challenge that most organizations take is saying, how do we go take things that we've been doing in the data center and push them out to the edge? And the first place that you can, look at that is having a common, visibility into data, having a, common view across the organization is the first challenge that companies work on. So they, this data center out model has yielded a real focus on AI, ML type, use cases. And when that, has kind of been reaching, more critical mass, that opens up a whole bunch of questions around how do you automate more? How do you have more of a, manageability? How do you have a consistent architecture across? And I think this is where, where we're both focused. But what I think the opportunity is where you can take it from those more data center out use cases to the core operations use cases, where the, the actual controller is influencing the actual production situation. And I think that's the really interesting. We're still early in the, in the data center out version of edge solutions, but we also now have this opportunity to really change the controls market itself. And I think, we're going to do that in tandem with with that existing ecosystem. That's going to be the priority focus. One of the things.
Sorry, Mark. I was just going to. One of the things I think you mentioned a couple of things I kind of want to, bounce around as a thought is. You're talking about the data center out. I mean, in Intel, and I talk a lot about this, is the intelligent edge. What that is, and it's taking that kind of data center type of approach and putting it on the edge. Why is that important? You mentioned a few of the things as well. We know that there's a lot of data that's locked up at the edge. We know that there's latency-based applications that sit at the edge around edge controls. So bringing these powerful compute platforms, enabling them with a very highly flexible but incredibly resilient stack that sits in there, meets operational SLAs in that environment, really is about, so I've got compute, I've got operational SLAs, and I've got intelligent capabilities that sit on top of that around AI, which you bring that cloud scale compute down. So you bring in kind of the cloud to the edge, and then you're enabling that edge to be kind of like, supersize it effectively with these capabilities. And then the last part, I think, which is really important as well, industrial, as I say, their business is about making stuff, So one of the things that they look for, of course, is always these operational SLAs. But I always kind of peel that back as well. This is a trust business. So, working together in this environment between Red Hat and Intel, building that trusted environment together with those partners is really important. So showing them what can be done, showing them how we can scale, showing them the flexibility, and making sure that it meets those performance requirements and those SLAs that are going to be needed. So, again, I just see, Red Hat has got all of that expertise at the software layer, at the infrastructure layer, the IT layer, that cloud capability that you're bringing down, the data center down, and then bring that up with the compute stuff, enabled compute with TSN, TCC, these wonderful acronyms that we can use, but basically enabling that together through that edge insights and edge control, bringing these things together. You can kind of see it. This addresses real problems. So, again, so I just wanted to emphasize that point, because a lot of people ask me, why don't I do all this in the cloud? This is easier. Yeah, it's not that easy. And when you get to the edge, there's all sorts of rules. Regulation sometimes kicks in. Data issues kick in as well. So you got to bring that to the edge, particularly around these factory environments, these manufacturing environments. They want that data. They want it to reside where they're going to use it. So that's that IT/OT flexibility that comes in. So again, I just wanted to add that in. I know you had a question, but I just wanted it's such an important thing.
No, I agree with you. And that seamless experience, from the cloud to the edge and, all stages in between is a big part of it. And, I talked about manageability. You were hitting on security as a key, issue here.
Yeah.
And, obviously the performance requirements, things like latency, become really interesting. I'm seeing in the chat, there's some questions about 5G, for example, about that. But I'd love to just get your take on, as you're going through, kind of going forward, looking at the way this is going to evolve. I know that we have a collaboration around FDO. The security space, broadly is a really important investment area. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about what you see as the most important considerations as we try to move from where we are today through that transformation journey that we were just talking about.
No, great question, Mark. So first thing I'm always going to say is listen to your customer. So, me and you are probably going to be very hot to trot around that, which is, let's solve problems that customers are seeing, customer challenges. Just say, I think we're on, a fantastic trajectory with the partnership, integrating some of the things that we've talked about. You ask about what comes next and where do we go? As I say, always keep a mind's eye on your customer. Let's solve their problems. Let's focus on what they're looking at. You mentioned the word security. I think security, when you come to this industrial edge, it's such a hot topic. I mean, if I have 1,000 customer conversations with customer, I'm bound to get 1,000 people asking me around the issue around security. And security is end to end. Don't get me wrong. It's not like Intel and Red Hat can solve all of the security problems. But what we can do by working together is bring out the powerful capabilities that exist inside the Intel silicon and align that with the Red Hat software capabilities and security. You mentioned FDO, like secure device onboarding. The ability, how do I flexibly but securely integrate devices into this network? That's that technology that we're developing and integrating. We want to go beyond that as well. We look at data, both control and user plane data. Customers want to know their data is safe, So as it's moving around this compute environment, how do we make sure that data is safe? So I think this is an area that I think as we go forward, we're going to be extending the relationship and the technology to address some of these areas that we can. And then working with, of course, application vendors. We need application vendors to sit within this infrastructure. So, and that could be some of the larger corporations to provide things such as PLCs, the soft PLC companies in the world. Right. They are companies that provide this operational code that drives the factory. They want to know when they're running their code on this infrastructure, what that does is it picks up all of the security requirements that come through. So again, we'd be working with application vendors together with the infrastructure and actually drawing through all of the security capabilities that exist right from the customer perspective all the way down to the infrastructure and addressing that as we go forward. So that's one area that I think as we evolve this relationship, you start to see us talk a little bit more about that and some of the things we do in it. But again, let's be very clear. We'll be doing that with customers. So we're solving their immediate pain points, the ones that they're concerned about today. We talked about latency and those areas. Again, we've obviously already started on that journey to look at that. How do we enable this time-sensitive network? We want to extend that as well, particularly into what I call a heterogeneous compute environment, which becomes very important. If you're abstracting your applications onto these intelligent compute platforms, you want to make sure that services that need to run inside those compute are optimized. So the orchestration layer may be in OpenShift. Hey, I need this application to run with this type of performance, this SLA. So how do we do that and make sure that does? So again, optimizations, making sure we're listening to our customers and offer that through. So again, security, enhancements around latency, more work around operations and maintenance to make sure that our customers truly get the value of IT. And then I think we're just opening up a tremendous opportunity. As me and you, Mark, go and talk to customers and we talk to them about what they're doing, I think that in turn is going to lead to even more questions. We'll build the right trusted relationship, we'll build the right partnership and platform, and then go and work with customers and application vendors to make sure our customers get the best results out of what we're doing together. So that's kind of the journey I see that on. So yeah. And I'm going to bounce one back to you, Mark, as they do. So, what do you see in terms of the use case priorities over the next, 1 to 2 years? How do you see those use cases? How do you see? You're obviously out there speaking to customers as well. So what's your view on that?
Well, it's easy for us, those of us that kind of are living and breathing this, to be, kind of maybe cycling further down the journey than people are ready for today. And I think your comment around driving this with customers and really kind of going through that journey with them is a big part of where we are. So, you have to resist the temptation to, accelerate the movie a little bit. But there are some themes that I think are really playing out relatively quickly. I talked about how it kind of has really started with a real focus on AI ML type use cases. And we love that. That's a place that's going to be, a critical investment area. I'm really excited about this increasing focus on, the core operations, production optimization type use cases that come with introducing, open source into the controller kind of space. Another thing that I think is really going to be important, it gets a lot of attention in the broader market right now, is just the supply chain issues and how people can leverage, the solutions that they're driving in their own operations to extend beyond, the boundary of the enterprise and have, a real kind of holistic view of the supply chain. And, and this is where I think a lot of the cool data sharing activities are happening now and focusing on. I think that's going to be a really exciting space to watch. And the other one, I see a couple questions have come in already about sustainability. We're seeing, obviously, all customers have, really high priority sustainability, net zero, carbon neutral, however they frame it, initiatives in the organization. But the blending of edge technologies with those kind of sustainability initiatives, I think, is going to be a really rich space. I think we're going to see a lot of convergence of the, the requirements around how the fact that I'm making these investments to drive out edge architectures, how that can then help support and really accelerate the sustainability initiatives overall and make that a little bit more real. I think that's going to be another really interesting space. I don't know if those resonate with you or if you see others.
I tell you, yeah. No, look, you mentioned the word sustainability. Someone said to me, what motivates you? So, and there's lots of things that motivate me, but nothing more than the word sustainability. I looked at this and as I mentioned, I cover the energy markets as well. So, I think everything that we do here and when we start to build these platforms, how can we do that understanding what is the impact from a sustainability? And I'll give you a couple of examples. You talked about carbon neutral computing. That's great. Let's optimize our platforms so that when we run applications and services, we do that with a minimal impact in terms of the carbon environment. But let's go one stage further. You integrated supply chains. Well, why can't we integrate supply chains in the use of energy? And, there's another area I think you'll start to see where this relationship develops, where the work that we've been doing on the grid modernization around microgrids. So how do we bring in renewables, renewable power into the manufacturing environment so that as you're making manufacturing decisions, how does that impact your carbon footprint? And again, think about it. If I've got an intelligent platform that is running my controls environment, my operational environment, I'm picking up data, I'm aware of my compute, and I'm also aware at the same time, what is the power I'm actually consuming as I'm building that manufacturing? And where is that power coming from? So now I can start to make very interesting decisions. Am I manufacturing something that needs to be done in the afternoon where maybe I'm getting a little bit more use out of my renewables? Where is that energy coming from? So I think you're going to start to see sustainability have a whole new way around what we call this intelligent manufacturing. We talk about Industrial Transformation 4.0, which have talked about the impact of AI. That initial impact was all around how we can improve processes in the factory. Of course, if I can use data to make a better decision in the factory and I can improve my quality, that has an impact on sustainability. Simple. I don't have so many defect products in the market. I'm not sending something else that has to be returned, which has an impact. So there's one impact. But now we're going to extend that with the work that we're doing well beyond that gated factor and start to actually connect it in a much more intelligent way to the way that they're consuming in power. So I see my supply chain, which I can now optimize to make sure I've got goods coming in that are aligned to my customer objectives. And now I can run those same services that sit on that platform to actually start making better decisions around how I'm operating and running my factory to deliver on my orders into my customers. And I can make decisions around order fulfillment, just-on-time manufacturing, sustainability. So again, this infrastructure. And I want to just add one thing around that as well is, there are standards that sit inside manufacturing. Of course, for those of you who are out there listening, as we evolve this infrastructure, we want to make sure this is not about going backwards. This is about going forwards. So making sure that if there are standards that we have to comply to with the infrastructure that operate around security and operability, we won't go back. We're making sure that our platforms, the ecosystems and the partnerships that we're building address this are compliant to that, and we'll extend that into the sustainability area. So, sorry, Matt, I jumped onto a whole, it's a very passionate subject for me, the word sustainability, because I really, it's one area where I see everything that we do is going to contribute to that. And I really want to be, if I could say something with manufacturers, that as you go through this transformation together with us, not only will we help you improve your factory, improve your output, reduce your defects, improve your flexibility, but we're actually going to show you how you can do that and improve your sustainability. I think that's a really good story for a manufacturer. I think all manufacturers are very highly interested. So again, that's an area. One other topic, Mark, I just want to jump in. I know we're kind of coming to the end and we get questions, but the topic of 5G comes up a lot.
Yeah.
So, what is 5G, what it is? I mean, you mentioned the learnings that we're taking from the telco earlier, which I think is phenomenal. We're not doing something new here. We're learning as we go along. But how do you think 5G impacts, what's going on in the industrial landscape, maybe around private wireless and things like that? What's your thinking around that as a technology and its impact?
Yeah, and we did get several questions about that. So I'll start, and then I'd love to hear your view on this too.
Sure.
My view on this is that 5G is really an accelerator, not a core enabler. That the value of these use cases kind of comes independently of 5G, and then 5G just accelerates and opens up, more. And so we're working with a number of customers that are really looking at network modernization as a theme of what they're trying to drive with their edge solutions. And that's a key use case. And then 5G is going to be an enabler of accelerator of other use cases as well. And that's really how we view it. I think the question that many organizations are wrestling with around how much do we do ourselves? How do we rely on and benefit from the investments that the telco operators are making, which are tremendous, that the public cloud providers are making, and how can we benefit from those? I think a lot of that is going to be worked through over the next 2-3 years, and we see that only kind of accelerating the adoption of these technologies. But we don't see that as a requirement to get them started. And we're already well down that journey, I think, today with a lot of companies. So I view it more as a accelerator rather than an enabler, right? It's not something that you have to kind of clear before you can open up the opportunity, but it just makes the opportunity bigger and richer. That's how we're looking at it. I don't know how you view the private 5G space.
Yeah, no, you captured it really well, Mark. A couple of things, I always sort of abstract and say it's about connectivity predominantly. How am I connecting my applications, my factories, edge to cloud, edge to edge, and within that as well. I think 5G has a role to play in the private wireless environment. Absolutely. It offers unique characteristics that were not there in previous wireless technologies, as in 4G, 3G, etc. This low latency, this ultra low latency that is extremely important if you're going to connect an operational workload up using 5G infrastructure. So there are some very good characteristics around that. Private 5G, of course, keeps it engaged. It keeps it at the factory. Go back to one of those issues around security. And there's some security capabilities that come inherent by using 5G. But ultimately, to your point, other technologies exist at the edge, whether they're Ethernet or even in the Wi-Fi domain. And we've seen evolutions to Wi-Fi with Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E, opening up a new paradigm in terms of a new 6 gigahertz span. You're going to see a mix of connectivity technologies that exist. What is important is wireless technologies do add flexibility. It enables manufacturers potentially to connect things much faster than they did before because they're not locked into the wireline environment that they had before. So they can do things. And that's particularly relevant in 5G over maybe wide area coverages. So let's take an example where you might want to use 5G in petrochemical, for example, oil processing, an oil refinery plant. These plants cover very large areas. So if you're going to connect camera technologies around that plant, might be a good example to use that. So there's an example that you do that, you connect your cameras up, and that's a use case that would then potentially feed into what we're doing here in terms of that data aggregation point to get the data off from those cameras. And then what you're doing with the data that comes off of those cameras. Maybe it's looking for faults around the factory. Maybe it's looking, at outputs that's coming out, maybe over some of the flames and things like that. There's all sorts of things you can do. So I see 5G as a distinct enhancement, but I think it's one of a plethora of things. I think what we're going to see is very much a mixed bag of connectivity environments that sit around the edge that offer all of the right services. So again, think of it as just something that's there. It's usable. I think as the use cases come along, we take that, again, customer approach first. What's the customer issue and where they're trying to go? So again, 5G, very important. And again, it allows us, look at this compute platform. 5G services, when you talk about RAN and things like that, radio access networks, again, these are software assets that now can exist inside the infrastructure that we've been talking around today, this intelligent edge. So again, you're not building yet more boxes. You can add that capability into what you're doing today. So, I mean, so again, look forward to working with you guys on that as we go forward as well. So I don't know, have we got any other questions in there, Mark, that you think might be good for us to kind of leverage it?
One that I'm really interested in, it seems machine design must change to make key aspects more easily adjusted based on control systems. Is existing equipment limiting how fast this change can occur? That's a great question. My personal view on that is not really limiting, because there's so much creativity happening now around the sensors and extensions and things like that. And so we see a lot of interest in brownfield type use cases rather than greenfield. And so I don't know if that's the case, but I think ultimately, like as I was saying before, the ecosystem itself, the control systems, vendors, their solutions, the way they think about their business model is changing and will continue to change. And we do see that becoming much more horizontal platform, just like we saw play out in the telecom industry. And so you will see, I think, a disaggregation maybe of things that were formerly kind of much more integrated and proprietary. But I don't see that as a real roadblock. I don't see a need to have greenfield deployments and entirely new control systems to jumpstarting the work. I mean, we're certainly seeing it happen without that. I don't know if you have a different take.
No, to coin a phrase, I don't know if it's appropriate, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater is the phrase I would use, which is, look, I always work on this premise. Again, I go back. What are one of the customer issues that we talk about? Cost. They're very sensitive to cost. So if you're going to change something, you do it because there's a benefit to your factory production. Ultimately, you're trying to reduce your cost. So you talk about brownfield as well. So yeah, if there are legacy assets that sit inside the environment, of course, we have ways to get access to those as best as we can into the infrastructure. If you're going to implement AI didn't exist in those brownfield environments. That's where this infrastructure comes in. It allows you to build a foundation around some of the new things that you can do. And then what you can do is look at how do you connect that into your brownfield assets, to your appliances. You can either do that with wrappers or extensions or probes to get access to the data. Of course, somewhere along the line, those legacy appliances will eventually become end of life. Everything does. I mean, if you think about brownfields today, they were built on technologies designed in the 1990s. Going back to the question that was asked there, it was built around a Purdue model, 1990 technology. And yeah, if it's working well, we can use it, we can access it, we can build this infrastructure, allow some of these new things. And then as that time goes past, I do believe that those legacy appliances will start to migrate. Let's think about this when we do it. So what is an appliance? It's an application that sits on a piece of hardware that does a function. Well, what we can start to do is disaggregate some of these things. Let's take that application out and maybe we move it into this infrastructure, but we can keep some of the other assets running so that actually you're starting to do this kind of brownfield, greenfield, and you're not reinventing, you're not rebuilding. Once you put it into that new infrastructure, it opens it up to allow us to get access to many more things. And then, of course, as you're going along, if you want to then optimize for a new type of machine that's bringing in maybe cobots or robots, as we're starting to see those coming in, of course, then you can start to do that. So again, you're absolutely right, Mark. This applies equally, actually more importantly around brownfield, because you have to start this journey somewhere, this transformation. So let's take what you've got today, go and work with that environment, work with the infrastructure that we're building. We can add new capabilities, look at those legacy capabilities to see how we can work with them. And then you can start that journey and, on your industry transformation. And you do it around your customer problems what you're trying to solve, your cost models, and we can optimize around that. And again, this thing scales. It can scale from a small manufacturer, these small, medium business manufacturers, right the way up to some of these, huge manufacturers. For example, in the discrete manufacturing, the auto manufacturers are some of the largest manufacturers on the planet. So we can scale it to meet your demands as well. This isn't just a one size fits in this little box over here. The infrastructure is flexible, brownfield to greenfield, and also flexible in terms of your size of business. We hope that the work we're doing here is going to enable industries across the board. So again, a good question. Yeah. I hope I added to a bit of the answer there.
Well, and I think, I know we're running short on time, but I know you just touched on one of the other questions, which I think is important, around which industries are moving quicker or slower on this change. And, I think the point that you just made is exactly what we see, which is it's across the board. But you talked earlier about electric grids, and I think that's a place where there's some really interesting, investment and activity happening. We're really excited about some of the work that's happening there. The other space where we've seen a lot of, early adopter work is just the auto OEMs. They've been really creative in adoption. They have, other business reasons to be driving this as well. We've seen a lot of innovation there, but we really are seeing this as fundamentally a kind of cross the industrial sector kind of transformation that's happening. I don't know if you want to, add anything else on that, faster, slower industry dimension.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much across the board. I mean, I work, as mentioned, in the grid. We're seeing massive grid transformation. We're actually seeing governments now getting involved here. You've seen, if you're in the US, there was an infrastructure bill that was passed by the current administration that really has a big emphasis on grid modernization. That grid modernization extends not only to the grid, but also how the grid then interacts into manufacturing. You mentioned some of the manufacturers as well. I mean, everybody's going through their transformation, of course, and they're all going to go through it at their timelines based upon the problems that they're addressing. So grid going quickly. In aspects of manufacturing, you mentioned the auto companies. Again, I agree with you 100%. A lot of focus on there, particularly, these auto manufacturers are looking at their own transformation as well. They're moving rapidly away from combustion engines towards EV. That requires a completely new dimension around manufacturing. I'm changing my entire manufacturing process. Well, if I'm going to do that, how do I want to manufacture? I want to manufacture around a more modern environment. I want to be able to use data much more efficiently in my factory. I want to be able to take my factories and make sure that if I operate something on one factory, I can share that across the board. So that's that infrastructure layer. And again, I think the last area, and it's a bit more tricky, but the small, medium businesses, they make up an enormous amount of the manufacturing globally. I think I've seen numbers around 90% of the world's manufacturing is in small, medium businesses, up to $200-300 million. And again, each one of them is looking, and they get together. They work in consortiums to drive change as well. So I think each one of those is going to go through some transformation. We'll see accelerations around auto, which we're already doing now. And as I say, I've already started to see some of the small, medium businesses saying, you know what? This technology is accessible for me and my factory and my environment. I don't have to wait for one of the large companies to go and build something now. I can engage with companies like Intel Red Hat on my transformation. I can leverage that technology, and I can start introducing things such as machine vision into my environment. And we're seeing that across the board, whether it's in machine vision for bottling, defect detection, quality assurance. So again, pretty much uniform everywhere. Some of the bigger guys are taking different approaches, but we're ready to scale and engage across the board. So, I mean, it's just a great time, Mark, to be working together with you and as we go on this journey to solve these customer problems and work with them. So I think it's been great. I've really welcomed the opportunity to sit and talk with you today, but even more importantly, as we build a personal friendship and a work relationship that, we're passionate about bringing what we're doing into the industrial domain to drive outcomes that customers, are looking for to address their problems. So I really appreciate that. And I was going to hand it back to Jill, maybe to kind of wrap us up, Jill, if you would. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And a great presentation, gentlemen. I am afraid, of course, we're going to have to end there. However, if you presented a question that we did not get to, those questions will be forwarded to our speakers today. I would also, before I finally wrap up, is remind our audience, please take a moment to complete that feedback form that, if it hasn't popped up on your screen, will be popping up momentarily. We would appreciate you doing that. And of course, I would like to take a moment to thank Mark Wolfarth and Ricky Watts for their presentation today. I would like to thank our sponsor, Intel. I would most of all like to thank our kind audience for their attention and their great questions. And finally, on behalf of Industry Week, I'll say thank you and have a great, productive remainder of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.